Hey y'all, so we are back again. This is Poli-Side-Eye. This is my friend Jared, my co-host. Just when we think, we've navigated to like a peaceful spring and summer, with the vibe, we have a war to worry about. And, this has pretty much dominated the news. Like I haven't heard anything about COVID lately. Have you?
No, not in, I mean, we can only do one thing at a time in this country. We can't walk and chew gum. So one issue at a time. So we're focusing
That's
on
true. So this has dominated the news, and I'm not familiar with foreign affairs at all. I don't know what this means for the United States. I know we are a very selfish country, and we're just wondering, what does this have to do with us? Also, I know that they've already started, like, can I call it an attack?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Invasion is probably a better, more suitable term, but I think attack is fair too.
So the gist of it to me is Vladimir Putin wants control of the Ukraine so he can make a Soviet Union. I don't know. But America is aware of his threats and he dares somebody to interfere. And right now, Ukraine is like hoping that someone interferes.
So I think that's somewhat on par. So
Okay.
Interestingly, I like that you at first said the Ukraine when you were talking about how Putin perceives Ukraine, but then I don't know if you noticed, but you later just said Ukraine. You didn't have the. But that's an important distinction because. So I was reading this piece yesterday, actually talking about the importance of not saying the Ukraine, because part of what's going on is that Putin doesn't view Ukraine as a sovereign nation or a sovereign country. And so what that means is that he ultimately believes that that territory is still a part of kind of the Russian empire, if you will. And so putting the in front of it implies like it is just part of this broader kind of Russian empire, whereas Ukraine kind of emphasizes its independence. And so I do think that that's important. It's an important distinction that may seem like splitting hairs, but part of what's going on here is that Putin doesn't view Ukraine as an independent sovereign state, and that matters because for him, it's like, well, we're only invading what is rightfully Russia's. And so, what's the big deal? And so I think to really understand that motivation, it's also important to think about Ukraine, where it sits geographically, what it's typically meant kind of historically within the broader Soviet Union, which was formed in 1922, and why Putin is so kind of fixated on Ukraine as kind of this important territory.
Would you consider Putin a totalitarian?
That's an interesting question. So some people have likened him to like Joseph Stalin, who was the leader of the Soviet Union for almost 40 years, pretty much from the mid 1920s all the way through the early 1950s. And so one could say that. I mean, but Putin's an interesting figure. So I was also reading another piece about him talking about his political ideologies. And so when Putin came to power at the end of the 90s, he kind of gave conflicting stances. On one hand, he kind of has this very nationalistic view of Russia as, he being the person who's going to restore Russia to its rightful place as like the Eurasian power, if you will. But he's also done a lot of things during his tenure that is very much compatible with kind of ideals of Western capitalism. Like there's been much more corporate influence in Russia. And so that doesn't necessarily subscribe to so the thing with totalitarianism is it's kind of like this one singular figure is kind of pulling all of the strings of industry and politics and the social order and so forth, but that hasn't really been the case for Putin. I mean, I would say he's very authoritarian, so that's an important. So what I mean by that is that he's very much committed to using state power ultimately for his own ideological ends. And so I would say that's definitely customary of Putin. I don't know about totalitarian, if totalitarian is fitting though.
Oh, okay. I guess I just equated that to being parallel to like a dictator, being totalitarian.
So some people have called Russian like an oligarchic state. So essentially there is kind of this upper echelon of super wealthy men mainly who kind of control all of the levers of state power and kind of the economic systems and so forth. So totalitarian implies that there's really this one person who is kind of singularly involved. And so I think that's a little bit more simplistic than is what's actually going on.
Why does it feel like he's been in power since I was like a teenager?
I mean, he has. And so he came to power in 19. I was reading about this too. Again, like I majored in history, but I wanted to refresh my Western civilization bona fides. And so what I was reading about was, how does Putin come to power? Because when he comes to power, he's a relatively unknown figure in Russian politics. It's not like he has this kind of deep-seated organizational ties or whatever. And so what I was reading was that the previous Russian president, Boris Yeltsin, ultimately groomed Putin to kind of be his successor, largely because he believed that Putin was one of the few people that wouldn't essentially put him in jail or if he were to assume the presidency. And so Putin kind of backdoors his way into the presidency. And so the reason it seems like he's been in power forever is because there was also a change to the Russian constitution, to the way that terms were set. So before you had, I think it was 2 4-year terms, which Putin served. And then there was a period where after that was over, he stepped down and became prime minister, which Russia has a different configuration. So president is like the head of state, but then there's the prime minister. And so he served 4 years as prime minister. But then while he was serving in that position, there was another change, which then meant that the Russian president could serve for 2 6-year terms. So he comes back to power. And so now he's serving his second of 6-year terms. So technically he'll be up in 2024. Though whether or not he actually steps down, if we make it to that point, remains to be seen. So, I mean, in some ways, he's been in power now for, since the end of 99. So that's been what, 20 years, 22 years? With the exception of the 4-year break when he served as prime minister.
That sounds very House of Cards. I forgot the lead character. It's been so long.
Frank Underwood.
Frank Underwood. It sounds very Frank Underwood. But briefly, if you're able to, can you explain what's going on in layman terms? And because I know this is updating by the day.
Yeah. So again, I think it's important to think about Ukraine, where it sits geographically and historically, what it's meant for the broader Soviet Union. So Eastern Ukraine is, there's a large part of the population that is Russian speaking and generally a bit more, let's say, sympathetic to Russian politics, Russian ideals, and so forth. Whereas, as you move further to the West, they tend to be a bit more sympathetic to Western aims, so Western Europe and the rest of North America and so forth. So that's why, like, when people bring up NATO, like, that's why that's kind of a thing, because where it sits, it's like kind of sandwiched in between most of Western Europe and then Russia. So Putin doesn't view, and he was very explicit about this, he doesn't view Ukraine as being its own independent nation, essentially. He views it as being a part of the broader Russian empire, and as such, like, he believes that it needs to be absorbed back into it. And so trying to find the motivations or what his end game is has been hard, because you can read whatever publication you want, everyone's coming to different conclusions. And so part of it is a question of interpretation. Like, is it the fact that Putin's trying to restore the USSR to its glory days? No one really knows. So the only person who can answer that is Putin. And so for Ukraine, there's also been this question of like, well, for Russia, they view Ukraine, or Putin, let's just say Putin, because, he's really the one of the primary actors here. And so for him, he's like, well, we can contain Ukraine from being closer to the West, closer to the European Union, closer to NATO and so forth, then that will serve as somewhat of a buffer between Western influence kind of impinging on Russia's, whatever their concerns, desires, ideals are, or whatever. But then some people are like, NATO is really not that big of a deal. Like, he's kind of hand waved at NATO, but ultimately, like, that's not really what he's after. He's really after this kind of nationalistic project to restore the Soviet Union to its glory days. And so it's kind of hard to make sense of what he really is after, because Ukraine doesn't pose a military threat to Russia, so that can't be the issue. It's not a resource-rich state, so it's not like it's brimming with oil, so that's not really an issue. And also, Russia is itself a fairly resource-rich, actually extremely resource-rich country. So people are trying to like find other geopolitical reasons or practical reasons why Putin might be wanting to do this, and he's not given any consistent evidence as to what that might be. And so that makes diplomacy harder, because part of what you try to do with diplomacy is try to get to the root of what actors' intentions are, and he's been very all over the place with what he's after. And so that's what makes it so hard to really get a sense of what's going on.
Right. Who's winning currently?
What do you mean by winning?
Like, who's succeeding? I'm guessing no one wins in war, period, if you want to really think about it. But is Ukraine like at least putting up a good defense?
So Putin has told the Ukrainian army to stand down, put down their weapons and so forth. And he claims they're carrying out a special mission. Now, what that mission is, the only person who can answer that question is Putin. And so whether or not who's winning is not really, in my opinion, a legitimate or really an important question, because it's going to be hard to know what the implications of all this are. I mean, we can easily say who's losing, which in this case are the Ukrainian people who are having to, live under this invasion. But then also, again, going back to the kind of the broader economic geopolitical questions. So one thing that Biden has been adamant about is that there's not going to be any boots on the ground, at least not U.S. boots on the ground in Ukraine. Like, he's been very explicit about that. And so as a result, like the way that they being the U.S. and its allies, most members of NATO, so the U.K. and France and pretty much all them countries in Western Europe, what they have ultimately decided to do is to impose sanctions on Russia, economic sanctions. And so the sanctions are meant to target Putin and some of his cronies in some of his elite circles, in essentially hitting them where most of their money is being held, which is in like real estate, in stocks and stuff like that. And so they're hoping that since those sanctions are going to be a bit more targeted towards elites, it'll have less of an impact on, everyday Russian people who really don't have any, this is beyond their control. Like, they're not the ones who are authorizing the invasion or anything like that. And so the issue with sanctions is that there's always some type of downstream impact that impact, everyday people who are just trying to survive. And so I think and I'm not one to paint the United States or the West as being moral superiors. I've been very adamant on that.
We know.
So part of what's going on here is that they're trying to think of targeted ways of pushing back against what Putin is doing, largely through economic sanctions. But again, that's going to have all kind of implications for even us here, because Russia, once again, is a very resource-rich state, largely through its oil reserves. Yeah. And so there's going to be all types of concerns about energy, not only in the US, but in fact, in many places in Western Europe, it's going to hit them much harder because they're much more directly dependent on like oil exports and so forth from Russia. But then also in the so-called global South, many nations in Africa will be impacted by it. So it's going to have all types of global implications, but the extent to which it'll be felt is going to vary depending on where you are. And whatnot, but everyone I think is going to feel this to some degree. And in fact, the gas station by my apartment, fortunately I live where I don't have to drive as much, but yesterday the gas there was $3.59. That same exact gas station where I usually fill up was $3.19 like 2 weeks ago. So I would say that I think most American people should be prepared for similar, but it won't just be gas, but think about all the places where oil and petrol, where that types of energy is used. I mean, so also heating. So if you live somewhere where it's really cold, that could show up in your heating bill. And so I think there's going to be all kind of broader implications. And so the question then is, how do you minimize the impact on like ordinary people who are not calling the shots and who don't have direct stake, at least direct stake being, elite stake in what's going on?
Well, I'm guessing like the silver lining to that can be like to be forced into clean energy.
Yeah, so this is also complicated because I was listening to another interview of somebody who specializes in Russian politics, and he was saying that for Russia, the energy crisis doesn't feel as pressing for them because, again, they're a resource-rich state. So for them, so think about where Russia is. And so most of Russia's northern border is essentially like a tundra. Like it is extremely cold. It's uninhabitable. Even trying to navigate that terrain is really difficult. But the person who was given the interview was saying that for many Russian elites, like they view global warming as somewhat of a benefit to Russia because it will melt some of those areas in which people have been unable to access. So for them, like they're like, oh great, like there's this melting here. We'll finally be able to go up and tap into even more of these resources that we haven't been able to. So even from the standpoint of climate, it's been hard to get Russia on board with a number of the provisions that are being, discussed. A lot of it is just rhetoric. For them, it's kind of like, oh, well, climate change might give us an opportunity to reassert ourselves as like a global power again. So for anybody who's watching, I think you should read everything if anybody presents something as though this is a simplistic situation, like they're lying to you. It's not simplistic. There's no easy causal answer to any of this. And so I think we just need to be honest about like the complexity of what's going on.
Yeah. And I also want to give a disclaimer, like we're trying to talk as much about this as we can in like a span of 25 to 30 minutes. So we are going to leave some things out.
There's no way you can discuss this in 25 minutes. So this is just a very small nugget. Then y'all have to go off and do the rest of y'all homework.
So I think my biggest question is, how close are we to a World War III? Or is it just like sensationalized news?
So I actually hate the World War III framing because I think it rids us of the ability to do what we're doing right now. Like it rids us of the ability to think about this in a nuanced way and think about what's unique about this situation relative to other situations. And so I generally avoid the World War III rhetoric for the same reasons I don't like when people say that voter suppression is the new Jim Crow. Like let's leave past events where they are, assess them, evaluate them in their own historical period, and let's evaluate these situations in their own context. And so I don't think that is necessarily a fair comparison, largely because the other World War II in a lot of ways was like World War I on steroids. Like it was just kind of like the sequel, but they had like a real budget and like hired like A-list actors to kind of carry out. So it was just a different kind of trajectory that I don't think is quite true for this situation. Now, that's not to say that the conflict can't become broader in scale. Like it could be the case that after this Ukrainian invasion, Putin might decide to move further to the west. Like that's very possible. And in fact, there's been some evidence to suggest that he might be considering that. Again, no one knows other than him. But I don't know if there is a desire, even among Putin, as reckless as he might be, because there is also a very real threat of nuclear war. And so I think everybody is concerned that the fact that there are nuclear weapons on this earth that could literally, in a matter of seconds, completely obliterate entire human existence.
Yeah. How big is the span of damage can a nuclear warhead do?
Well, some of the nuclear weapons that exist now, from all indications, from all intelligence and so forth, imply that it could legitimately, we could wake up and the whole earth could just be completely blown to smithereens. Like, so there's that, which is, again, I think that's partially why many elites are banking on Putin not wanting to escalate this too much further, because while he is reckless, is he suicidal is another, which is really what it is. But again, the only person who can answer that question is him. But I do think that there is an important recognition among most parties involved that anything remotely close to a so-called World War III would legitimately obliterate life as we know it. And so it's not 1945 again. And so I think everyone recognizes that, which is why there's been so many treaties over the past however many decades trying to essentially limit the development of new nuclear weapons and so forth, because everyone knows like it's one of those games that once you let that cat out of the bag, like there's no way of getting it back in. It's that we're done. So
right.
Yeah, I don't think you can underestimate the magnitude of that point.
Well, this went abysmal really fast. It's pretty scary. What's the likelihood of the U.S. being involved, like bringing military over there, or like people making fun of the draft or whatever? I don't think that's even possible these days.
Yeah, there won't be a draft.
Right.
I think there's far too much leftover residue from Vietnam for that to not be the case. Politically, it would be suicidal. If Biden even uttered the words draft, he would probably there would be an immediate like coup. Like that's not gonna be the case. Now, again, people are wondering, well, Biden is as steadfast in his view that US won't have any type of military intervention. But then there's the question of, there is a NATO charter which has provisions in it which says that if NATO members are attacked by other, outside forces, in this case Russia, then allies have a responsibility to protect them. And so the question then becomes like, what if Putin does in fact move further to the West and does in fact invade a country that is a part of NATO? Like, would there be some type of military intervention? I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier. I think most people recognize that having an actual military escalation, given that all of these parties involved have nuclear weapons, which could, with a pressing of a button, obliterate life on Earth, like, is that the route you want to go? And so I think they're trying, to the extent that they can, rely on sanctions and hopefully diplomacy. But again, diplomacy is tricky because it's hard to be diplomatic with someone who is not transparent about what their intents and what their desires are. And so how do you negotiate with somebody who is not clear about that? But one thing that I think we need to also reckon with is that, we're in a different position. Like, the US is, we're essentially living in an order in which the US has more or less called the shots for the last 80 years. And now you have China, which is kind of, we haven't talked about China, but they're kind of the ace here, because China has a huge economy, by some measures now a larger economy than the US does. It's also an ally, or is becoming an ally of Russia. So what does China do here? Like, so far they've been kind of trying to toe the line. Like, on one hand, they are ultimately saying that, Russia, you probably shouldn't be doing this, girl, but, it ain't really our business. So it's just, but part of that is because they're thinking about their own geopolitical position in the world. And so then what happens there? And so I think what we're seeing really is really beyond just a question of tactics. Like, it's a question of politics. Like, there's a US in the West, and then there is China, and to somewhat lesser degree Russia, who all have different interests about what they think the world should look like. And so how do you reconcile that when people have competing differences about that? For Russia and China, they're like, yeah, we want to be on this global stage, but we don't want to fucking listen to the United States. We don't want to participate in this world that they build. We want to do on our own terms. And the US is like, yeah, no, we can't have that because, we're the one who call the shots here. So there's definitely a power dynamic here, which is at play, which is really what was the kind of the crux of the Cold War. It was just competing views of how the global world should be ordered. And so I think that's the bigger normative question that you won't really see people talking about in the New York Times, because the assumption is that the US and the West know best, and they are the ones who should be leading the charge. But the fact that that's being called into question by Russia and in recent years, China, I think is throwing things off a bit as far as kind of the global pecking order. And so that's another question that I think we have to think about.
The way you just explained this, it It just reminds me of a Housewives episode where like drama is like it's brewing between like, you know, two different wives that's competing with dinner parties and who's the queen bee. Like that's just how I'm looking at it right now. It just sounds very similar.
Yeah, I mean, that's what imperialism is. Like, imperialism is one nation or country intending or wanting or desiring to impose its vision or view of the world in other places. Like, that's legitimately what that is. Now, that can be done through all types of means. It can be done militarily. It can be done, I don't know how you can do that diplomatically, but people claim it can be done diplomatically. But ultimately, at the root of it is it's trying to expand one's influence on the rest of the world. I mean, that's what the Cold War was about. It was like, for the US standpoint, it's the expansion of Western liberal capitalist ideals. And for the Soviet Union, it was essentially pushing back against Western ideals and saying that, no, like this communist model is the one that is best suited for, it's the best model to which other places should adhere. That's kind of really at the crux of it. And so even thinking about wars and invasions and sanctions, all of that is tethered to this same kind of overarching question of which model is the one that everyone should adhere to. And that's, you can't, there's no right or wrong answer to that. That's an inherently political question.
So this is my last question. We need to do maybe like a part 2.
A whole series on this.
Right. Getting it back to like just the normal people. Like, what do you say to those people who just want to put their head in the sand to this? People in the United States, it's just like, oh, well, we just getting through COVID. Like, I just don't want to stress myself out worrying about this. Would it be weird, like, you know, people just planning a trip to Europe or something like this and just not even worrying about what's going on?
I don't know about use the term weird. I mean, it's a very selfish way of thinking about things. So I saw someone on Twitter dunking on this NPR thread. The title of this piece that NPR ran the other day, it was like, here are all these tips for how to manage for Americans to manage the crisis in Ukraine, like hashtag self-care. And so it like goes through all these things.
Oh my God.
Oh yeah, the cult tweets were like in shambles. But yeah, and so from one standpoint, it's very selfish to just be like, oh, this is just too much for me. Like, I'm just go vacation south of France because I just can't take it. But also, like, I mean, it is. But you know, that's how people think about these things. I'm like, yeah, we're not the one. I mean, part of it is it's the U.S. privilege. It's like we've never existed where we don't live in a place where we have to worry about an invasion from Canada or from Mexico or anywhere around. And so we're isolated from more or less like any concerns of those types of things. And so I think the issue is that people need to recognize that we live in an extremely interconnected world now. And so people are going to blame Biden because and again, I'm not defending Biden. I'm not defending the US empire, but they're going to blame him for gas prices going up and so forth. And to me, that is a reflection of the fact that we live in an increasingly globalized world. So you can't just, even thinking about, climate change, this crisis, even when there was the so-called Great Recession in 2008, all of these events are global. Like, we have a globalized financialized system. We have a globalized system with respect to thinking about ecological questions. And so all of these things are going to affect everybody, irrespective of where you are. Again, it might affect you differently. So Americans may not be as directly implicated as, say, people who live in Poland, but you'll still be affected some kind of way. So I don't even think just putting our head in the sand strategy is necessarily going to work, because it's still going to have some type of implications for you. You may not recognize it, but to me, like, the way you start to get a sense of this is you actually try to understand what's going on. I think what happens is that people feel powerless in a world where so many things seem to be going wrong, and there seem to be no agents. And so I saw somebody post on Instagram, or it was like a meme or something. They were like, oh, Russia just invaded Ukraine and we all just sat there and watched it. I'm just like, well, what do you want somebody who lived in like Topeka, Kansas to do? Like, it's not, we don't all have the same access to the same levers to make these types of decisions. And so I also get annoyed when people just be like, oh, Russia did this or the US did that. I'm like, no, we are not all equally culpable. that's not to say that we shouldn't have some responsibility to understand and to empathize with what's going on everywhere. I think everyone has that responsibility, but we should also recognize that everyone's not equally guilty or culpable for what's going on. But I don't think that the way you go about this is just by putting your hand in the sand and being like, oh, well, yeah, I'm just gonna go take my cruise because the world's gonna blow up anyway. So we'll get the last good one in. Like, I don't know if that's the right way to go about it, but that's just my stance.
Right. Well, I guess we can put a button in this for right now, and I'm pretty sure our next episode is going to deal with this as well. Do you have any articles or suggestions for people to read anything?
Yeah, so there was a really good podcast episode out, and I can't think of the title of the actual podcast episode, but it was by a journalist named Tony Woods. I think a journalist, kind of political commentator, who speaks about both Ukraine and Russia from a political historical standpoint. And so he tries to trace the trajectory of the Soviet Union over the 20th century into the 90s, and how the dissolution of the Soviet Union created the political environment for Putin to come to power and for Russia to essentially get to this point. And so I think that's a good primer if you don't have a good understanding of what the Soviet Union was and how it dissolved and so forth. And so I will send you the link to that, and then you can link to that in the comments. But yeah, it was by a guy named Tony Woods. It's like an hour and some change. And so it's a good interview. I think he uses very clear, easy to follow language. So for people who are just not, rehearsed on the history of both the Soviet Union and Putin and Russia, I think this is a good episode.
Yeah, and first and foremost, you listening to a podcast, I was just like, oh, well.
I only listen to academic podcasts though, so I don't listen to like pop culture ones or usually it's some person who is like explaining something. It's not like, although this one is entertaining, but yeah, I've become less of my heart line on podcasts is eased up, so not much, but just a little bit.
I love how he just said that he just doesn't listen to my show. And it's fine, because this is why I have Poli-Side-Eye. And again, thank you for your perspective. Like, I'm pretty sure we learned something. I definitely have. Where can they find you on social media, of course?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter mainly and Instagram, both JAYC Tiger Fan.
Okay, well, I'm going to get back to my vacation in New Orleans, but I am still thinking about this, and my empathy goes out to Ukraine, of course.
Your empathy while you're imbibing and getting, no. You still have to, listen, you can't sit and just lock yourself in just, to some degree, you still have to function. And so, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, y'all, that's our episode. We will be back in March for 2 episodes. I'm pretty sure one of them will be about this, because there's so many other ways this conflict can go. But yeah, we'll see y'all later. Bye.